And then the book ends in a place of wonder and awe, because I guess I find that the more I practice mindfulness and presence over the years, the more that that is where I end up falling in my life as a thing that I want to cultivate for just everyday moments. A sense of amazement, a sense of being present to wonder, and really a different kind of wonder and awe than we're used to hearing about. It's not the wonder that's standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon or looking out at this huge waterfall. It's the wonder of seeing, a mom joking with her kid in the grocery cart, and both of them laughing. It's just these little bits of wonder and awe that have really called to me over the years.
Welcome. You are listening to Our Mindful Nature, formerly titled The Mindful Minute. I'm your host, Meryl Arnett. This podcast explores the deep connection between land and self through nature-based meditations and meditative experiences that invite us back into belonging to each other, to our ancestors, to the earth, and to all beings that make up this universe. If you would like to access these meditation practices as standalone audio files, please subscribe to my newsletter at merylarnett.com. It's free, and you'll receive a new mini meditation each week, along with behind-the-scenes content and bonus material for each podcast episode. All right, grab a cup of tea, pop in your headphones, and find a comfy seat. Let's settle in for today's episode. James, my friend, my poet, newly published author yet again, welcome back to Our Mindful Nature. I'm so glad to talk with you.
Oh, me too. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Meryl.
Same. And I know I put this in the email, but I have been dog-earing and writing in and crying over every page of your new book, Unlocking the Heart: Writings for Mindfulness, Courage, and Self-Compassion. Such a gift. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I think you mentioned something about some coffee stains on the pages as well, which I think,
Well, obviously,
somehow coffee, tea, and poetry, I just think like you have to have both. They go hand in hand, really.
both very soothing for the soul.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was thinking, James, as I was getting ready for our conversation. So the last time we talked, we were just witnessing like the first horrors of the Israel-Palestine war unfolding. And today we are talking days before the 2024 presidential election. And that was not planned. We didn't say, oh, let's talk at this time about this big thing. And it just struck me as what a stark reminder that life is filled with difficult, scary, hard, challenging moments. And how something as simple as awakening to presence, as 3 minutes and one poem and one sip of tea, perhaps, can feel truly like a bit of a balm, a bit of help with that difficulty, that hardness. And I just throw that out there to get your thoughts. Like it's an interesting overlap how we've ended up talking at hard times,
Yeah.
and how poetry feels like such a gift for those hard times.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those observations. Yeah, it does seem fortuitous, I guess, in a way that and appropriate that we're talking at these kind of threshold moments for our world and society. When it comes to grief, loss, whether it's personal or global, I think we would never choose to invite these threshold moments because they're so difficult to endure and to be with. And yet they're here. We know they're going to keep showing up, hopefully not quite as often as they have in the past few years for all of us here in this world and in this country. But But suffering will find us, and I know that's the um, part of the teachings that I've taken on. And so, what do we do in the face of that suffering? And part of my practice is meditation, the practice of mindfulness. And what has become such an integral part of that is the writing and reading of poetry. And both are important to me. I think I have a reading practice really with a habit of also writing in response
Mm.
to what I read. But both really dovetail to ground me in the moment, like you were saying, with a sip or gulp of coffee and or tea. And this is just part of what allows me to be present. And it can feel like such a balm, as you were saying, but I also think that for those of us who are feeling like we're in emergency mode, whether, trying to get everything done, being so busy in our daily lives, but also seeing what's happening in our country and in the world and wanting to help and be present to that as well, it can feel like an indulgence. Like, well, I don't have time. The world doesn't have time for me to take even, 3 minutes to write a poem, to read or write a poem, and then to have a cup of tea. Like, there's just no time for that. And I would argue that, there has to be time for that if we are going to keep showing up. And so, I think my publisher was a little confused about what this book was going to be. They're like, wait, is it a journal? Because it has writing in the title, and I'm like, no, I really see this as more of a contemplative sort of
Mhm.
devotional book that maybe, like it sounds like you did, you kind of sit with it in the morning or at a quiet time in the day, and you just sort of take in the poem, maybe read the reflection that I've written about it. And there's an invitation afterwards, which could be a writing prompt for journaling, could be just some internal reflection or a conversation that you carry on with someone that you're close to. Um, so I really envision it as more of a contemplative book, just some like a companion for
Mm.
difficult times.
Mm. That is, you achieved your goal. That's how
Oh,
I
good.
experienced that book. And, one of the things I have noticed, particularly in seasons that feel very difficult and or very busy, is that I'm fully aware that sitting down and doing my meditation practice will be very helpful. And sometimes that feels like a mountain I am unable to climb, right? It feels so hard to sit and be with the many layers of thoughts happening, feelings happening in a moment. And what I have noticed is in those moments where I think, this is so hard or this is so uncomfortable, I've used your book almost like I want to say like an oracle deck, right? As I've just
Mhm.
opened it up, whatever page it's gone to, that's the poem I've read. I've read the reflection. And it's not necessarily, I mean, you have these poems sort of in chapters almost of courage and grief and self compassion, lovely. And even without going to the chapter of like, this is what I need today, it doesn't even matter. It's almost like it just helps to cut through all the noise and get me to reflect on the thing I'm meant to reflect on in that
Mhm.
moment, right?
Yeah.
It's such an interesting, helpful tool when there's just a lot happening in the moment or in the mind or in the heart to say, actually, let me just focus right here on this. And it is sort of external, but it's
Yeah.
very internal.
Yeah. Well, I love that description of this book as an oracle deck. No one has ever said that to me before about a book that I've written. But, I think it's not even just my book, it is maybe poetry in general, because I
Mm,
can't tell you how many times I've had the same experience of picking up a book I didn't know or I didn't even think I would like. And then I open it right up to this poem that's like, whoa,
mm,
that was what I needed to hear. It slowed me right down. And I wonder if it has that oracle deck feeling because poetry is coming from this mysterious, more intuitive place. sometimes I write the poem that I most need in a
Mm,
day, and I don't even know where it comes from. It's not like I was, lying all night, like thinking, oh, these lines, these are going to be good in this poem tomorrow. I just sit down and a few lines come, and it's sort of like a trail of breadcrumbs, and I follow it. And so I guess that's why I'm interested in offering ways for folks to follow that same practice, whether it's just to receive a poem I've written or to use that poem as a jumping off point for reflection in your own life, reflection in writing. So that really resonates for me.
mm,
And, there's this little kind of ribbon that comes in the book. And at a reading this weekend, I was joking with someone because she said, I ordered the book, it came, and then the ribbon was in this particular place. And I opened the book right there. And that was the poem that I needed to read that day.
mm,
And I've heard that a few times. And so I just think it's so up to chance, what we come upon. And the book is divided into these sections, but even as I read from it and share from it, I'm opening to wherever it falls and
mm.
kind of letting chance guide me as well.
How did it come to be these particular sections that spoke to you? Courage, self-compassion, grief. There are several. What called you to those particular titles?
Mm. Well, I think I noticed what my poems were kind of most focused on. And so, there seemed to be a group that was really focused on, courage and vulnerability. That's probably one of the most central things that I've been writing about over the past few years. And something that I've been practicing in my own life, just the courage and vulnerability to share my work more freely with the world, whether it's publishing it, sharing it on social media. Um, I think there's self-compassion has been such a huge part of what I've been writing about because when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, I, like probably a lot of other people, realized, oh, I haven't been so good about self-care in my life. I haven't really been practicing
Mm,
the kind of self-compassion and mindfulness toward myself that I, preach in my teachings, So there was kind of a realignment that had to happen there. And of course, it now seems appropriate. I have a poem called Self Compassion, a poem called Self Care, and a poem called Self Love. So
That's
my
perfect.
my poetry is trying to tell my stubborn self some things here. So that was like a ding, ding, ding. Okay, that's an obvious section. Um, and then there was also grief and healing because I was working on this book, really putting it together the first year after my mother had passed away.
Mm,
And so I found that a lot of the newer poems that I was writing and revising were really in that mode. And then gratefulness and joy. So someone had asked me to share a few poems centered around joy as I was working on this manuscript as well. And I noticed that I had mentioned the word joy 77 times in this book, whether it's in
wow.
the title of something, the text, the reflections, in the poems themselves. And I was a little floored by that because I really thought, the title of this says mindfulness, courage, and self compassion. So that's what I thought I was working on. But in some ways, I now think of this as a book that's more about finding joy and holding on to
Mm,
joy in the sort of mix of all of these other emotions as well. And then the book ends in a place of wonder and awe, because I guess I find that the more I practice mindfulness and presence over the years, the more that is where I end up falling in my life as a thing that I want to cultivate for just everyday moments. A sense of amazement, a sense of being present to wonder, and really a different kind of wonder and awe than we're used to hearing about. It's not the wonder that's standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon or looking out at this huge waterfall. It's the wonder of seeing, a mom joking with her kid in the grocery cart and, both of them laughing. It's just these little bits of wonder and awe that have really called to me over the years. So that felt like a real landing place for the book to kind of
Mm.
end up.
I think one of my favorite things about the experience of reading many of these poems is that they do feel like you're just giving us this snippet of a day in some way, but it is in such detail that it almost requires you to go, man, have I ever paid attention to that one tiny way of seeing something that happens every day, the way the light is falling, the way a leaf sounds under your foot, or whatever it might be. Um, it is the most mundane yet magical description of mundane that there could be. That,
Mm,
and to me, that is the definition of awe, right? Is
right.
finding it in that moment.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the mundane and the magical, and
Mhm.
finding the magical in the so-called mundane, because these are things that, in the rush and the despair of things and the worry of things and the busyness, we really rush past a lot of these moments of, just the light shining through the leaves and the light and the shadows mixing together. There's a poem called Light and Dark in this book that's one of my favorites that I've ever written,
Mm.
in part because it talks about um, this phenomenon that we don't have a word for in English, but of course the Japanese have a word. They call the mix of light and shadow as the sun is shining through the leaves, komolebe. And it's such a beautiful thing that there's a name for this to me. And it feels like such a metaphor for how we're called to move through the world, looking for the moments of light, even as the shadows are falling across our path as well.
Mm.
And that we have to take both if we're going to stay alive to the moments of wonder, awe, joy, whatever else it is that we want to cultivate, that it all kind of has to be mixed together, like that light shining through the trees. And I would say too that I am often surprised by the poems that come, and especially as I'm working on them and letting them work through me, I I don't expect to be kind of taken so deeply into a moment, because it's not that's not necessarily how I live my life. Just, sometimes I think reading my poetry, you might think that I'm always just stopping and, beautiful mood all the time and just in awe constantly. But often they're just these little slivers of moments that I have been somehow, very deeply present for, usually moving on far too quickly to the next thing or worrying about the next thing. But I think that is part of what my mindfulness and meditation practice have allowed me over the years, is that, those little tiny gaps of when I'm able to be present kind of keep getting very infinitesimally
Mm.
wider and wider over time, so that it almost happens accidentally. And luckily, I have this writing practice that's now part of my spiritual practice, so that I'll wake up the next morning, probably super tired, not in the best of moods often. And I sit down at my desk with my notebook anyway, just as I sit down on the cushion with meditation, often when I don't feel like doing it. And I'm always surprised by what comes. Like, oh gosh, I did notice, the red-winged blackbirds in the trees singing the first songs of spring. I didn't realize that that registered, or that I was noticing the whole scene, until I sat down and kind of let it move through me again.
Mm.
And so, oftentimes in my teaching, whether it's writing or mindfulness or both, this practice of simple pausing, to really let something land, I think is one of the most important things. And so that's why I'm a little obsessed with this word pause. It's the name of my weekly newsletter, the Weekly Pause. I have a writing community called the Weekly Pause, which I think is probably confusing for people because I'm calling all this stuff pause, but it just feels so important. And I now think of it as a sacred pause when I am able to
Mm.
really drop in, even if it's for 30 seconds. That's a relief when that happens.
Yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit about what your practice looks like. And I don't know if you even look at it as like a whole, like you do all of this together or it's spread out over the day, but I love that you referenced a reading practice, which I'm stealing because I have that and I've never had a name for it. And so now I'm calling it that.
Yeah,
That's
there
amazing.
we go.
And there's a writing practice and a meditation practice. And I'm just curious what that looks like for you.
Mhm. Well, I would say the most structured part of the day for me definitely is the morning. So,
Mm.
waking up usually pretty early, definitely before my husband is awake. And when it feels like the whole world is still asleep, is when I tend to do my best writing and thinking. And then I make some coffee and just sit down right away at my desk and just kind of see what wants to be spoken through me. I have a practice of doing just automatic writing. So just kind of journaling for 2 or 3 pages and seeing what comes. And if a poem feels like it's bubbling up in the middle of that or a little essay or something, I try to be available to that as well. Some days there's just not time for that. So being flexible and not rigid and not kind of self-flagellating when that time and that presence isn't necessarily there. And then right after that, usually I go into just like a 15 or 20-minute meditation and then kind of slowly start the day after that. And I try not to pick up my phone, check messages, email, or look at headlines or anything like that until I've written, until I've meditated, because I find that if I don't have those elements in place, then it's almost like that scaffolding isn't there for me in my body and mind to kind of hold all that's coming at me and all that's coming in. And then usually the kind of, I'll say, the practice and the struggle throughout the rest of the day is trying to build in space for maybe another shorter meditation, shorter
Mm.
or longer, depending on what there's time for. Um, stealing another 15 or 20 minutes here or there for some writing, whether that's revising or writing something new. And then likewise with the reading, I love reading before bed and kind of making sure that I'm not looking at screens, usually about an hour or more before bed, because I find that that just wakes up my mind too much.
Mm.
And so that's when I would say I do the bulk of my reading. But again, it's just about stealing time throughout the day. And some days are fuller than others. But just, allowing, kind of having these things to fall back on and then allowing them to bubble up through the rest of the day, whether it's reading or writing, in the midst of the endless emailing and, doing all the stuff
Mhm.
that one has to do for work.
Mm. I am thinking about one of my favorite poems in the book,
Mm,
which is about the word busy
yeah.
and not saying that word, which has been a really fun, interesting reflection
Mhm.
when I noticed how often I say that word.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might read that
Mhm.
poem to us as we move
Absolutely.
on. I think it's page 53, I think.
Oh, great. Thank you for having that. Yeah. So, as I think I say in the reflection here, I wrote this poem. I think I was doing a reading with the poet Naomi Shihab Nye, and she actually said, I have cut the word busy out of my vocabulary. I don't use it anymore. I don't say it because I noticed that the more I said it, the busier I felt, which I thought, well, that is really interesting. And so I've done the same thing. And this is kind of a playful take on cutting it out of my own lexicon, but it's really hard. And I still say it. And we have that word busyness, which feels appropriate for how we lead our lives. And yet at the same time, I do not like saying I'm busy, I'm busy.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
so I think Naomi is right. And every time I read this poem, I'm reminded. So thank you for asking me to share it. This is called One Word I Don't Need. I am banishing the word busy from my mind. Like picking stones from the lentils I have just washed in the colander. Is there an uglier word than busy, with its two hurried syllables and hard consonants rushing out of the mouth? Used mostly as an excuse not to be where I am right now, which is leaning over the sink and letting lentils slide through my fingers, feeling their smoothness as I soften into the minutes, no longer seeing this as a task, but simply imagining what it will be like later to savor the lentils after they've simmered for hours with roasted tomatoes, cumin, and coconut milk. When we ladle them into waiting bowls and silence our phones, laying them both face down on the table.
It's such a beautiful reminder. And as
Mm.
you were reading it, I remembered that in my head, I was like, I wish he shared the recipe for that soup.
I will send it to you. It is really good.
It
It's really, really
sounds
good.
amazing.
It takes a while to prepare, so I think that's why it came into my mind because I don't make it enough because it does take that
Mm.
prep work and the lentils have to cook for a while. Um, But it is such a good reminder to just, and even as I was reading the poem, I felt myself softening into like what I'm doing right now, making this meal for myself and my husband. This is the most important thing. I don't want to think about all the other things I'm, quote unquote, giving up to do it or putting off or the things I'll have to do later. I just want to be here for this. And I think a lot of us feel that way too.
The one of my personal reflections that came from the writing after that poem, because I love to cook. I love it. And I noticed that during the week when I feel very busy, I would find myself being quite irritated standing in the
Mm,
kitchen. I've already worked this long day. I'm very tired. I would love for food to just be on the table already. Do I have it in me to do this? And as I was reflecting from that poem, what came up for me is that, the one thing that is easy to overlook, but is very true for me when I cook, is that I am doing it as an act of care for whoever is in my home in that moment to eat
mm.
with me and for myself.
Yes.
And so this whole much longer than I expected reflection came out of that poem. And I didn't even end up writing about busyness per se. I ended up writing
Mm,
about cooking and what that
mm,
means for me. And you have a line, I think maybe in the introduction, that you believe we are all born poets. I'm paraphrasing, or born as poets, or
mm.
which I bet a lot of us are like, that's not true. And I didn't write a poem per se, but I wrote a lot and I felt a lot. And I would love to hear a little bit about that belief for you and what it means to invite us into our own writing practice, even if we're not going to share it with anybody or revise it or do anything at all with it.
Mhm. Yeah, well, as you say, I mean, it's really, I think when we sit down and reflect, as you did, um, it's an act of care for ourselves for sure, but it becomes an act of care for the other people in our lives because the more we're able to reflect and pause and really kind of come into the interior of ourselves, I just believe it makes us better, more present people for the other people in our life as
Mm.
well. And I think that, writing isn't the way to do it, but it's one way to do that practice. And I think it is something that we who are blessed enough to be able to read and write, we have access to language. We use it every day. We're just not always using it in an intentional way or really paying attention to like you were saying with the cooking, like reflecting deeper on what does this mean for me, this practice, this act of cooking for myself and others. We're not used to using language in that way. And so I think that poetry, especially poetry that opens the door and says, oh, don't worry, you can come in too, even if you don't like poetry, even if you think you're not a poet. I think that's what my poetry, I hope that's what it does for other people. And I
Mm.
hear that from a lot of other people that they pick up this book, even though they're not poets themselves, or they really didn't think they liked poetry. There's poetry out there that is like an open door that will invite you in. And I would like to think that all the poems here, you may not like them all, but they all are welcoming enough for you to kind of get, for it to land in a single reading. Um, so, as far as the writing, I do think that we are all born poets. We begin by learning the alphabet through rhyme. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's a rhyming song. That's how we learn our letters and how we learn to make words. And so I think very literally we begin as poets, but if you spend time around younger people, you know that they're always making these wild associations
Mm.
and creating metaphor and simile without needing to name it. And even we ourselves, if we really pay attention to how we see the world, we're also creating those metaphors. We're also seeing image in the world that isn't necessarily there. Like I remember being somewhere where there was a football game. It was a college town and everyone was wearing red. And I didn't necessarily want to be caught in the crowd, but I was. And I overheard this conversation between these people, and he was kind of looking out at this just river of red. And he's like, oh, it's like salmon, swimming upstream or something like that. And I was
Mm.
like, here's this guy, dressed in full football regalia, the colors of his team, and he's making this beautiful metaphor. So I just
Mm.
think we do this automatically. It's just a matter of being invited to do it in a more intentional, kind of self-compassionate way.
Mm. I love that. I recently got to interview Ada Limon, and she was doing this Poetry in Parks project and installed these poems in these national parks across the country. But there was a prompt along with every poem. And she did something that feels very similar to what you did, which was not to say, go write a poem, which I think immediately makes all of us
Yeah.
that are not
No.
poets sort of go like, that's not something I can
Yeah.
do, right?
Yeah.
And I don't remember exactly, but her prompt was something like, what would you say about the landscape around you? It was something along those lines. And I feel very similarly about your prompts is that they are so open. And as I said, the prompt that came after the busy poem, it wasn't about cooking, but it was open enough that that's where I got to go. That's what I needed in that moment was to be reflecting on. And so I love this invitation in the book is that there's a prompt and what comes out of it is for you, right? It doesn't have to
Mhm.
look a certain way. Your poems don't all look a certain way. Some of them feel very lyrical. Some of them feel almost like prose, like you're just getting a chunk delivered to you. And I think there's freedom in that, perhaps.
Yeah, and that is the way to invite, deeper reflection. Like just like you said, I think even for an established poet saying, go write a poem now about, this, or this would be like, what? Like that's an awfully stringent demand here. I think we just need writing to carry us forward. It might be a list, it might be a paragraph or poem. So I do try to keep it really open. And I also try to give folks, because I like this myself, just like a little line or a phrase to begin with, some kind of jumping off point so that we don't feel instantly overwhelmed by that charge to go and write something that's, publishable right away or something. It's really about play. I think that's why I like calling them invitations over prompts, because a
Mm.
prompt is sort of like, come on, get this done. And it's like invitation just feels like here's a set of open arms, you do whatever you will with them. And here's a few different ways you could go. Or what I always say, especially if I'm leading a workshop or retreat, is, you know, here's my invitation, but if this poem kind of brings up a memory, brings up an image for you, or you feel like you're on this thread, go that way instead, even if it's like the opposite of what I suggest, because this is not school. This is not right or wrong. We're not analyzing any poetry here. We're just seeing where it takes us, which
Mm.
I think is true actually of so many other art forms that we're used to having to analyze a poem to see what it means. And when you're met with a poem where you don't have to do that, then it can be about, well, what did you like about the poem? What did the poem bring up for you? In the same way that when we're walking through a museum, we're not necessarily analyzing what a painting means or a sculpture, a piece of art. We're saying, what do I like about this? What does it bring up
Mm.
for me? So that's what I like about this kind of prompting and inviting, is that it's just very open-ended.
You just perfectly articulated, I think, what I was experiencing when I was referencing your book as an oracle deck is
Mm,
this idea of you're just giving us a place to land as opposed to being in the abyss of consciousness,
mm,
right? Every one of these poems is like, here's a little ledge, a nook to pause, start here. And where
mm,
we go is up to us and listeners. My invitation, and I'm going to guess James's invitation, although you can tell me if I'm wrong, is to read a poem and then go into your practice, especially if it feels like a day that it's too hard to just sit down and practice. Start by opening it, give yourself a place to land, and
mm.
then see what's there for us. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the language that you're using. Just a place to land, finding that little nook to perch on, or just this quiet corner in yourself. I mean, I
Mm.
feel like that's what poetry is really inviting us to do. Like, when you're in a busy airport and all you want is that quiet corner, we're called to find that quiet corner in ourselves. And I think poetry can bring us there because it does invite us to slow down, pause, and just be where we are.
Mm. A quiet corner within ourselves. I love
Mm.
that. James, I could talk to you for days and days.
Likewise.
Would you perhaps share a poem and maybe a short invitation along with it for listeners as we wrap up today?
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. So this poem is called Prayer to be Changed. I ask for just the slightest shift in my thinking, the kindest sifting of my busy mind, so only wonder and peace are left behind. So that as I walk in sleet on this spring morning, I can see even these muddy ruts made by careless trucks on the forest trail as harbors of miracle, knowing they will fill with enough snow melt and rain for tadpoles to swim in come summer, until that sunlit instant when they feel the flexing of legs in the water beneath them and leap out onto the ground, their bodies having decided by pure instinct alone to be that soft and alive in this world. And so the invitation that comes along with this one is, the next time you feel the heaviness of anxiety and despair pressing down on you, just try to do what I do here, which is just to ask for this slightest shift in your thinking. You might ask out loud, you might do so in a piece of writing. And once that question is released, see what then calls to your attention. Can you find some of your own harbors of miracle that might give you the courage to be soft and alive in this world.
Thank you, James. Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Meryl. I appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Listeners, there will be links in the show notes to James's website, his new book. I highly recommend his weekly newsletter because it is this conversation in written form every single Friday. Friday, I think, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just a delightful gift at the end of the week. James, is there anything I didn't ask or anywhere you would like to direct listeners to pay attention to?
I don't think so. This
Yeah.
conversation has been a gift. Thank you so much,
Mm.
Meryl.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Our Mindful Nature. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or leaving me a review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps others to find the show. And let's face it, we could all use a few more meditators in our lives. Our Mindful Nature is recorded on Muskogee land and produced with the support of Brianna Nielsen. Deep gratitude is offered to acoustic ecologists Gordon Hempton and Nick McMahon for the use of their nature field recordings in many of these episodes. To join my live classes, ask questions, or learn about my teacher trainings, please visit merylarnett.com. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next week.